Hello world! I'm Kay and welcome back to Game Sprite Mode. Today we have the final installment of GameCube Theory.
What you are experiencing is a temporary distortion of reality.
Now, before I delve into the content of Season 3, I'm just going to do a quick recap of what happened in Season 1 and 2, which you can see the full videos as GameCube Theory Part 1 and GameCube Theory Part 2. So in Season 1, it really laid out the foundation for the series to come. We learned about GameSpace and GameCubes and how they operated. In Season 1 specifically, we learned that GameCubes were loaded into systems by the user and that they had very real consequences even though they were games. The objective of these games, of course, was to defeat the user, and if you failed, then the sector that the GameCube landed in would be completely destroyed, and any sprites, binomes, or living beings who were unfortunate enough to be trapped inside the GameCube at the time would be nullified. Another very important concept that we learned about in Season 1 was rebooting. This is the act of a sprite or binome being inside a game and double tapping their icon. When this happens, they download important skills, tools, anything that they would need to participate in the game. Now, Season 2 really built off of this by expanding upon how we as a viewer perceive game space. For example, we learned that games are vulnerable and are just as reliant on energy as every other being inside of the net. They require fully powered systems in order to actually function properly. We also start to realize that the components inside games are living organic things. There are several different types of game sprites, one of which, AI, can actually learn, think, and adapt. And we also get introduced to the idea that games actually exist outside of systems. So those were kind of the important points from Part 1 and Part 2. Moving forward, this video is going to be riddled with Season 3 spoilers, so if you've not seen Season 3 of ReBoot yet, I suggest you watch that before continuing on with this video. Now, just a little bit of information about Season 3 in general. So Season 3 has 16 episodes, which is much larger than the previous 2 seasons. Of the 16 episodes, only 6 had at least one game actually shown and present in it. Now, this really emphasizes a decline in the presence of games throughout the series, as this is just roughly 37% of the episodes have a GameCube in them. The previous season, Season 2, was 40%, and Season 1 was 61%. So as the show continues, you see less and less emphasis actually being put on GameCubes, but this in no way diminishes the importance of them in the show as a whole. So Season 2 ended off on a very dramatic note. Bob was betrayed by Megabyte and launched into the web, sealed outside of the system, leaving Dot, Enzo, Mouse, Andrea, and others to fend for themselves while the virus attempted to take control. So Season 3 begins on a slightly somber note. Enzo is left alone to essentially defend the system and pick up where Bob left off, playing games and winning them in hopes that the system can gain some morale and defeat Megabyte. This, of course, is very difficult since Enzo's a small sprite and not a full-fledged guardian like Bob was. So the first episode of Season 3, To Mend and Defend, starts off with Megabyte and Hexadecimal charging this weapon that they're using to gain control and potentially destroy the principal office. Not the best idea, but not much that Hexadecimal does make sense. A GameCube drops and lands directly on the weapon while Hexadecimal is trying to charge it, and she gets completely fried like a fly in a bug zapper. This really emphasizes just how much energy courses through a GameCube. Hexadecimal is an extremely powerful virus. She's even more powerful than Megabyte. So, in order for something to have enough energy to almost destroy her, it has to be a lot. This one part in the episode really gives us an explanation as to some of the occurrences in Season 2. We saw in one episode a GameCube diverting its path and not moving linear or straight down to go towards energy. And we saw another case where a game crashed because it was low energy. So this kind of makes the viewer aware of how much energy is required to actually power a GameCube. And this obviously makes sense given the behaviors in Season 2. So, as the GameCube is falling and frying Hexadecimal, Enzo can't go against his Guardian protocol and is heading straight to the game with Andrea. Now, thankfully, Mouse stops Andrea from getting inside because at this point they realize that win or lose, when the game leaves, so does Andrea. Dot winds up going inside with Enzo, and they're in a game called Malicious Corpses. Now, this game is just all around fun and awesome. We have Evil Dead references, Michael Jackson's, really creepy horror vibes. It's a very cool game in general. But one particular thing happens in this game that's really important. There's a scene where the user shoots at Frisket and hits him. Now, in the game, Frisket is very obviously injured. But then when the game leaves, they call for an ambulance for him. This shows the viewer that if you're hurt in a game, even if you win the game, the injuries you've sustained are permanent. This really solidifies the existence of game space in general. Games have always been looked at as this temporary thing, but really all of the effects are long-lasting. The consequences if you lose is, as far as we know to this point, permanent. There's no way to save a sprite who's been nullified. In the second episode of this season, Between a Raccoon and a Hard Place, we see once again Megabyte preventing anyone from getting inside a game, knowing that without any sprite intervention, the user will win and the sector will be destroyed. We saw this in Season 1, Episode 1, The Tearing, where he prevented Bob from making it inside GameCubes. We know that this is a good tactic from Megabyte's point of view because we see later on in this season that when a system continuously loses games, eventually it'll crash. Okay, so in general, I'd have to say Season 3 is very dramatic. This could arguably be one of the most dramatic episodes in the entire series. So Season 3, Episode 4, Game Over. The game in this episode is called Gods, Mortals, and Demons. When Enzo and Andrea go inside, they soon realize that the odds are really stacked against them. They would have to second guess the user and figure out which opponent he's going to choose. Now, interestingly enough, this is the first time we see in the show a game where you actually have a bit of control as to what you reboot as. In previous episodes, it was kind of random and predetermined, and you reboot and what you get is what you get. But we see in this episode that in this kind of Colosseum area, you have all the different characters that could be an opponent to the user, and you simply have to stand in front of whichever character you want to be, and then reboot in front of it, and then you become that character. Now, while Enzo and Andrea are inside attempting to figure out how to defeat the user, Dot and Fong are in the war room with others, and obviously Dot is very worried her brother's inside a game by himself. Now at this point, Fong actually mentioned something that's never been discussed before in the show. He outlines how there's a time discrepancy between game space and virtual space. which later on we realize that this means that time moves completely differently inside a GameCube than in regular cyberspace. Now, inside the game, Enzo has pretty much figured out who the user is going to be battling next, and reboots as this ninja thing. I feel like this is probably like a Mortal Kombat reference, but I'm not entirely sure. So he begins to fight the user, and the user actually hits him and hurts his eye. We see his eye scarred over, we see him cry out in pain, and we're going to see very soon this is going to be a lasting permanent injury, much like when Frisket got shot in Malicious Corpses. Okay, now the end of this episode is extremely important for all the events to come later in the show. They're in an impossible situation in this game. Enzo knows that he cannot win. Now, previously discussed in Season 2 and briefly at the beginning of Season 3, game sprites leave with games, where sprites will either stay in a system if they win the game or be nullified if the game is lost. So we see Andrea, Frisket, and Enzo tap their icon and it change. We're later going to know that this is game sprite mode. So they switch to game sprite mode right when the user wins the game. Now, of course, this is followed up by an absolutely heartbreaking scene with Dot in the war room watching in horror. Because she has no idea what happened in that game, she assumes that everyone who was inside that game, including her little brother, was nullified. Okay, so moving on to the next episode, Icons. This episode is just crammed full of information, and it is fantastic. We get a lot of answers to questions that have been not only raised in the previous episode, but further down the line. The beginning of this episode starts off in a game called Space Battle. It looks like a very Mars Attacks kind of outer space alien kind of game. And very quickly, as the viewer, we realize that the three aliens we see are actually Andrea, Enzo, and Frisket. So they win the game and switch their icons from game sprite mode to regular sprite mode, and they are dropped off in a completely decrepit but random system. So this is the first episode where the whole concept of game sprite mode and game hopping is really introduced. So at the end of the previous episode, when they knew that they were absolutely going to lose the game, they switched their icons to game sprite modes, and instead of being nullified, when the game left the system, they left with the game. Now, they use this tactic to land in other systems, and once they're in another system, they would just go in another game and play and switch to game sprite mode and leave with the system, which, like I mentioned before, is called game hopping. So right now, the viewing audience realizes that Andrea and the artist formerly known as Enzo, now Matrix, are all grown up. So clearly, a lot of time has passed, at least 10 years. So right away, once this whole explanation is given, they explain it to a couple of the binomes that are in this new system that they landed in. We realize that they've been doing this a really long time, years of just fighting and playing games, hoping that eventually they will land back in mainframe or a system that has ports to the net. Now, this system that Matrix and Andrea has landed in is just completely destroyed and on the verge of just crumbling to bits. This is a result from them not being equipped with the knowledge to win games. So right here, we see the end result of a system when games are lost over and over and over again, and it's destroyed sector by sector. Matrix and Andrea take it upon themselves to gather a group of the binomes that live there and teach them how to survive in games and also how to win them in hopes that they can help themselves. The game they enter is Kron the Destroyer. Here we see them once again explain what rebooting is and help them through the whole process. The objective of working together as a team in order to defeat the user. Now, thankfully, all their efforts were successful, and this band of misfits work together and actually win the game on their own. At this point, we see our three heroes, Matrix, Andrea, and Frisket, switch their icons back to Game Sprite mode and leave. So this episode really provided a really good background knowledge on rebooting, objectives, and also doing this, refreshing the audience's memory on these things, while introducing this whole new concept of switching in and out of Game Sprite mode. So now moving forward to episode 7 of this season, called Number 7. I just want to quickly touch on this because, as everyone knows, we didn't actually get to see a real game or much of it in this episode. It was all in Matrix's head, his imagination. But the one thing I wanted to touch on is the fact that he's frustrated and exhausted and just so done with game hopping because his fate isn't in his own hands. When you game hop, where you end up is determined by the user. So really, this is a very long, tedious process to net travel. Now moving on to episode 8, the episode with no name. We don't really see a game in this episode because it starts off with a GameCube that's already landed in a system, and the system voice saying, game over. GameCube leaves, and we see Matrix, Andrea, and Frisket there. And Matrix is overjoyed because he checks glitch and realizes that they're finally in a system that has ports to the net, meaning that they can use this system to go directly from there to mainframe. In theory. We realize very quickly that it's not going to be that simple, and they're going to have to take a more roundabout, scenic route to get home. Now, something really cool that happens in this episode is Matrix actually meets Turbo, and from Turbo he learns a really important piece of information. Only like 1 year has gone by, because game space, the time is accelerated. This was previously mentioned by Fong. Now, he didn't specify whether the time in game space was faster or slower, but here it's confirmed. Because they spent so much time in games, they compiled much quicker than they would have. And Turbo even says that he reckons Enzo would only be 1-1, which is binary for 3, as opposed to 1-0, which is what he was at in the beginning of season 3, which is binary for 2. So, i.e. only 1 year has gone by, but Matrix and Andrea have obviously aged at least 10 years. Okay, so for the sake of just the subject matter of this video, we are going to be skipping over a whole bunch of episodes. There's pirates, there's web creatures, there's a surfer, but none of that is important when we're talking about games specifically. So, we're going to be jumping ahead to episode 15, System Crash. So, they finally make it home, but they return to a completely destroyed system because Megabyte really did a number on mainframe while they were gone. So they come up with this idea to evacuate all the citizens into the principal office as the system is slowly crumbling around them. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up this episode is because something really cool happens. Well, probably not cool for our main characters, but a whole bunch of tears open up, just randomly, all around the system, and out of these tears come users from previous games. We see a character from Malicious Corpses, we see the Santa from that one Christmas game, we see pretty much every user we've seen since the beginning of Season 1. Now, Bob did have a theory how to return nullified sprites into their original form, and it had a lot to do with games saving files and data when it's won. Now, systems, I feel, act very similarly. They seem to store copies of all the sprites and files and everything that comes into contact. We see this briefly in an episode in last season, Painted Windows, where they had to do an undo command to undo all of Hexadecimal's mischief before there was an automatic save. Otherwise, all of her changes would become permanent. Now, keeping all of this in mind, it seems that every game that comes through this system, there's some amount of saved data, i.e. all of these users. And because the system was in such a weakened state, all of this extra data and saved code just came out, which really we've never seen anything leave a game apart from Andrea when she uploaded herself onto Enzo's icon. So this really emphasizes that even when a game leaves, parts of the game can stay behind. So when these games are played, parts of it are automatically saved into a system's internal memory. And that brings us to the final episode of Season 3, End Prog. So at this point they realize Mainframe is well past the point of no return. Essentially, it's beyond saving. So Bob comes up with this idea to allow Mainframe to crash in hopes that it'll trigger a restart by the user. Now we see the devastation that happens when games are lost, and realistically, with Bob gone and while Enzo and Andrea were gone, Dot was left there with only a few resources to fend for herself, meaning it was very unlikely that anyone was really going into games and winning them because she was so focused on just fighting Megabyte and winning the war. So the result of Mainframe isn't just the wear and tear from Megabyte's attacks, but also the result of games being lost. And we saw in Icons how this can be very close to pushing a system over the edge, while right here we are seeing the worst case scenario where a system completely shuts down. Thankfully, a user does a manual restart and all the sprites are restored. And that brings us to the end of Season 3, and also the end of the episodes I'm going to be covering in this web series. Now, it's no doubt that ReBoot was a show that was given a lot of TLC by the creators. Everything was done meticulously. The plot lines were very thoroughly thought out. And despite the fact that as the show went on, GameCubes became less and less the focus, it was still very impactful to the plot of the show overall. And honestly, GameCubes are part of what made ReBoot so amazing and made it what it was. There may have been less games as the story progressed, but the lasting effects of these games stayed with the characters forever. And I know that there's a lot of concepts in ReBoot where if you just quickly watch an episode, it's very easy to go over your head. So I hope that these videos really helped everyone kind of grasp the nitty-gritty knowledge involved with GameCube's game space, just games in general. And I definitely look forward on doing more theory-driven videos in regards to ReBoot in the future. So, this is Kay signing off. Stay frosty.